I'm going to talk broadly about insects. I'll talk about why they're important, in case you didn't know already. I'll say a little bit of the scary stuff about their declines, but I'm not going to dwell on that too much because it gets rather depressing. And then I'll talk mainly about what I think we can do to turn things around for insects. I've been fascinated by insects since I was a little kid, 4 or 5, 6 years old. I don't know why. I collected caterpillars and grasshoppers in the school playground and fields and kept them in pots, and usually they probably died, to be fair, because I didn't feed them the right leaves or whatever it might be. This is my youngest son, Seth, who's still in his kind of bug phase. There he is with his pet cockchafer, Colin, who sadly is also not with us anymore. But Seth loves his insects, and I hope he never ever grows out of that, as I didn't. And I consider myself really lucky to have been able to make a career from my childhood hobby. People pay me to chase around after butterflies and bees and so on, which is great. But sadly, most people don't really like insects by the time they're teenagers or adults. Their immediate reaction, if anything buzzes near them, is to flap around trying to kill it. They think it's going to sting them or bite them. They're frightened of it, which I think is really sad. And that attitude for me is really epitomized by this sign that I was sent a picture of. If you feel you've suddenly become dyslexic, it's Welsh at the top. But the English version there, it was in the University of South Wales this summer. Warning, flying insects in the area. My God, run for your lives. Yes, I mean, anyone seeing that sign will come away with the impression that flying insects are terrifying creatures that are a risk to our lives. But it was just some flying ants, apparently, which you think, well, big deal. Did they really? Anyway, so quick introduction to insects. They are one of the oldest groups of animals on the planet. The first insects appeared about 480 million years ago, which is a long time. It's twice as old as the earliest dinosaurs. So they've been with us, they've been here long before us. And because they've been around so long, they've speciated and diversified into just an unbelievable array of different shapes and sizes and weird life histories and behaviors and so on. We've named 1.1 million species of insect to date. But it's estimated that there may be another 3, 4, 5 million that we haven't yet discovered, that we haven't even named living on our planet. Isn't that kind of mind-boggling to think that we haven't discovered most of the life on our own planet yet? I sometimes wonder why we spend so much time trying to get into space when we haven't really explored what we have right here. So insects are amazing. They've been around. They survived the mass extinction events that wiped out other groups of organisms like the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. But now they are in trouble, and I'm not going to show you lots of examples of downward pointing graphs and so on. I could talk about the German data that found a 76% decline in insect biomass in 27 years. I'm just going to show you one example from the UK. We don't have good sort of long-term population data as yet for wild bees, but we do have maps which tell a similar kind of story as to what's happening with them. So this is the shrill carder bumblebee. It's one of my favourite bumblebees, actually. They're very handsome little chaps, or chapesses, and they named the shrill carder because they have an unusually high-pitched buzz. Once you've heard it a few times, you can actually tell there's one nearby from the sound. And they used to be a common insect. You can see pre-1960 they were scattered all over the southern half of Britain, lots of records of them. But as time has gone on, they've dwindled rapidly. And by the time I got interested in what was happening with bumblebee declines in about 2000, this species was down to about 6 populations in the south of Britain. I first saw this beastie on Salisbury Plain in the centre there. I spent the summer looking for rare bumblebees, and Salisbury Plain is an amazing place, accidentally protected by the army having preserved it for driving tanks and practicing shooting each other, but incidentally they've preserved an amazing wildlife area. Anyway, I spent a whole summer doing fieldwork on Salisbury Plain and found 3 or 4 of these bees and got really excited. But since then, that Salisbury Plain population has died out. And the one on the Somerset Levels a bit to the west there seems to be dying out. There's just been 1 or 2 bees seen in recent years. So this bee is, within my lifetime, more or less, has gone from being a common insect to being teetering on the edge of extinction in Britain, and that is just one of many examples I could show you. And of course, this matters. You probably don't need me to rehearse the arguments as to why insects are important, but I'm going to do it anyway. Insects, not just bees, they kind of make the world go round. There are so many of them, both in terms of numbers of species and numbers of individuals, and they're involved in so many different processes. The famous American biologist E.O. Wilson once said that if people were to somehow disappear, the planet would do just fine without us. But if insects were to disappear, the environment would collapse into chaos, was what he said. And he was right. So insects, for example, they are food for most birds, bats, reptiles, amphibians, freshwater fish like trout and salmon. They depend on insects. If the insects are becoming less common, then they will obviously become less common. Insects also provide lots of ecosystem services, as scientists rather clumsily call it. Things like helping to control crop pests, although the pests themselves are often different types of insects, so they're not all helpful. Things like dung beetles that are really important in recycling of dung, or carrion beetles and blowflies in the recycling of corpses. Really not very glamorous stuff and something that most people never think about, but it's really important, that release of the nutrients back into the ecosystem. They keep the soil healthy, they distribute seeds, they do all sorts of stuff that needs to be done, whether we pay any attention to it or not. Of course, the one thing that insects do that I think is widely appreciated now, thankfully, is they pollinate. People are a bit vague on the details, but most people are aware that bees, at least, are important as pollinators of crops and wildflowers. Of course, it isn't just bees. I know you're mostly beekeepers here today, but we shouldn't forget all the other insects, because pollination is actually performed by thousands of species. Just in the UK, one estimate suggests there's at least 6,000 species of UK insect involved in flower pollination. So it includes all of the bees, but then most moths, butterflies, loads of flies, wasps, beetles, and so on. All of them busy visiting flowers, transferring pollen, and ensuring that between them, 80% of all the world's plant species are pollinated by insects of one type or another. So if we didn't have insects, then most of the plants on our planet would ultimately fail to reproduce and would eventually disappear. And of course, you know this, sorry to tell you stuff as beekeepers you'll be very familiar with, but we, of course, ourselves depend upon insect pollinators to pollinate our food. And the usual statistics are that roughly 75% of the crops we grow in the world are at least partly dependent on insect pollination. That some of them would produce nothing without insect pollinators, some produce a reduced yield, and that includes everything from apples, cherries, strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, squashes, tomatoes, chili peppers. You could go on and on. Our shops wouldn't look so good without them. Even coffee and chocolate are pollinated by insects. So it would be really hard to feed the growing world human population a healthy diet without looking after our pollinators. And I've trotted this argument out hundreds of times, and I bet you've all heard it hundreds of times. We need to look after bees and pollinators for selfish reasons, because they do stuff that we depend on. But in recent years, I've started to kind of question whether this is the best argument to be using, because I'm not sure it really captures people's hearts and minds to tell them that, you know, the global value of pollination is $220 billion a year, or whatever the figure is. It's just a number. It's not that. I think the reason I have a problem with this is that it's not why I care about insects. I care about them because I think they're cool and interesting and beautiful, and It has nothing to do with their economic value. And also, it worries me that there are insects that don't do anything useful. And if we only value the ones that do something for us, then where does that leave them? To give you an example, this is the St. Helena giant earwig. Look at it, it's huge. It was obviously not quite that big, but it was a 3-inch long earwig that lived on St. Helena, this little island in the South Atlantic. Sadly, now extinct. Hasn't been seen since the 1960s. It's only known from a handful of specimens with pins through them in museums. We think it was wiped out by introduced rats that ate them. And anyway, so it went extinct. There was no repercussions. It wasn't doing something that needed to be done, that any other species depended upon, so far as we know. It just quietly went extinct. But it seems to me that the world is a poorer place for not having a giant earwig, even if none of us were going to go there and see it. To look at it another way, it seems to me that regardless of their value to us, we should respect the rights of other species to exist, to have a life. Most of them have been here much longer than we have, and surely they deserve a place on our planet. Just because we can wipe things out doesn't give us the moral right to do so, I would say. Anyway, so one way or another, I would argue that we should look after our insects, both the useful ones and the others. How can we do that? So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on these sort of 3 areas of solutions, if you like, to the insect crisis, and more generally to the biodiversity crisis. They are big topics, and I haven't got time to treat any of them very well. The farming, I'll talk about briefly, but it's a huge and complicated subject, and you may or may not agree with anything I say, but I'll briefly talk about my ideas for farming, and then I'll talk a bit about rewilding, and then I'll spend most of my time on what we can do in gardens, which is something more of us can get actively involved in. But first, let me say a few things about farming. So we've gone down this kind of industrialized approach to food production with ever bigger fields, ever more chemical inputs, both fertilizers and a whole range of different pesticides, and we're still clearing land, particularly in the tropics, clearing beautiful rainforests and replacing them with palm oil or soybean or cattle ranching, whatever it might be. And I think most people have just gone along with this. If we think about it at all, we just accept that industrialized farming is the only way we can feed the rapidly growing human population. And there are a lot of us, and there are more every day. It's a rather sort of scary statistic, but about 220,000 more people will sit down to dinner this evening than sat down to dinner yesterday. And we're going to get up to at least 10 billion within the next few decades. And we need to feed everybody. But I think there's a real danger that if we carry on driving to be ever more intensive, to do more and more of this kind of farming, that actually the system will ultimately collapse, because I don't think this approach to farming is sustainable in the long term. There are a number of reasons, 3 of which are kind of encapsulated by the pictures on this slide. The first one is the one I've already mentioned, that industrial farming is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss on the planet, which means it's undermining its own basis. It needs pollinators, it needs organisms to keep the soil healthy and to help control pest numbers and so on, and it's wiping them out. But also it's damaging soils. The United Nations released a report recently that argued that about 40% of the world's soils are now badly degraded. What are future generations going to grow their crops in if we don't leave them any soil? It takes tens of thousands of years to replace this stuff. So that is something we really need to stop. And then finally, food production in total, including processing and so on, produces about 35% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, which again we have to stop. So I don't think it's really an option to carry on the avenue we're going. It seems like a dead end to me. So what should farming ideally look like? I think maybe it's useful to just step back and say, okay, if this current system isn't great, what are the alternatives? What do we really want from a farming system? So it obviously needs to feed us all, and ideally feed us all a healthy diet. But I mean, maybe this sounds like I'm a bit of a hippie, but I think essentially we need to find a way to work with nature rather than trying to kill and control everything with pesticides, which means encouraging the natural enemies, which means probably using much less or ideally no pesticides at all. And of course it needs to look after the soil, which is quite a big wish list. But it seems to me there are farms that are already doing all of these things. There's some really exciting stuff going on in the world of regenerative agriculture more broadly. And I've just put up a few examples here of systems that seem to have properties that are really desirable. Let me tell you a little bit more about biodynamic farming, as I haven't got time to go through all of these, but biodynamic farming is really interesting. It's like organic plus. It's organic with a little bit of witchcraft added on top, which from a scientist's perspective is quite hard to swallow. They make kind of preparations and sprinkle them on the land for no obvious purpose. But if you look at broadly what they do, 99% of it is really sensible. And if you go to a biodynamic farm, and I've visited quite a few, they grow a huge diversity of crops. There's one in West Sussex that I went to recently called Plaw Hatch, where they grow 47 different varieties of fruits and vegetables. They employ 28 people on a 180-acre farm, which is way, way more. A typical farm of that size would employ about one person if you're lucky. The soil's black and full of worms and really healthy. There are bumblebees and butterflies and birdsong, and it's teeming with life. And if you measure how much food they're producing, the yields compare really favourably to conventional farming. So they're doing something right. They seem to be looking after the soil and looking after nature and producing food at the same time. And if they can do it with very little mainstream research and development funding or support from government, then surely we should learn from that and think about scaling it up perhaps and supporting this kind of approach. Anyway, that's my take. Let me move on to my second topic, which is rewilding. It's not everyone's cup of tea. It's a bit of a Marmite subject. There are certain people who really hate the word rewilding and everything to do with it. They're mostly farmers, I think. And I can sort of see where they're coming from, but let me explain what I think rewilding is and explain why I think it's actually a good thing that we should be doing a little bit more of. So I came across the term first in the context of the Yellowstone National Park, giant national park in the United States. And forgive me if you know this story, but I'll only give you the potted short version. Until quite recently, Yellowstone was in a bit of a state. It was very overpopulated with elk, which is basically red deer, but they call them elk in North America. And because there were too many deer, it was very overgrazed. There was little vegetation. The soil was blowing away. The trees couldn't regenerate. It was a mess. And the decision was taken to reintroduce wolves, which had been missing from the ecosystem for a few hundred years since they were hunted out by people. And they introduced, it was only a dozen or so wolves. It wasn't a large number. Not enough to eat all the elk by any means. They made very little impression on the elk population, but they changed the behavior of the elk, which is really interesting. So that the elk started keeping out in the open where they could see wolves coming and herding together and keeping away from steep-sided river valleys in particular, which meant that trees started to regenerate along the rivers, which provided food for beavers, and the beaver population rose rapidly, creating lots more dams and lots more wetland habitat for other types of wildlife. There's more to the story, but that's basically it. There was a big cascade of positive environmental benefits from replacing a missing kind of keystone species, a species that had been playing an important role, which had been wiped out. Now, sadly, from a UK perspective, I don't think it's entirely realistic to suggest that we bring back wolves anytime soon. I would be up for it completely, I have to say. I'd have wolves running around Surrey if I could, but I guess it's probably not going to fly just yet. Although I should say, if people think that that's complete crazy talk, but There are wild wolves in almost every country in Europe now. They've been spreading back since they've been protected in recent decades. And even the Netherlands has wild wolves, not very many, but it does have, and the Netherlands is a much more crowded and industrially farmed country than Britain. So if they can have them, we could. But anyway, that's not what I'm going to try and argue. From a UK perspective, I remember being taught when I was at university that Britain and most of Europe was a dense forest before people came along and started chopping down the trees and clearing land to farm. The primordial forest. And that view was kind of supported by the fact that if you take a piece of land in Britain and put a fence around it and forget about it, it will turn into a dense forest. But that belief that it was all dense forests leaves some big questions unanswered, particularly where did all the wildlife live that doesn't live in forests? Lots of our wildlife will only live in sunny situations, in meadows and warm sunny slopes and so on, things like the Adonis blue butterfly or any number of orchids or other flowers I could mention. Where were they if it was all forest? Well, actually, ecologists have mostly come around more recently to accepting that probably it wasn't dense forest, that it was much more of a patchwork of open areas and forested areas maintained by the action of large herbivores, which are now missing from the ecosystem. So we used to have wild ponies, elk, even if you go back 115,000 years, we had elephant wandering around. The auroch, the giant ancestor of the cow, and so on and so on. Wild pigs, of course, the boar. All animals that we don't now have in the wild. And so the idea is of most UK rewilding projects is to replace the missing big herbivores as best we can. And the project I know best isn't too far from here. It's the Knepp estate, which I'm guessing many of you will have heard of. So at Knepp, it's on the east side of West Sussex, not so far from Gatwick Airport, really. It was a 3,500 acre estate of intensively farmed land. And yet it's on quite an infertile, heavy clay soil. And they were making a loss, despite getting pretty whopping farming subsidies. They couldn't squeeze much food out of it, and they were losing money. So they decided to rewild, which essentially meant they put a fence around the whole estate. They took out the internal gates and fences. They introduced some longhorn cattle that can live outside without any maintenance, some Tamworth pigs to substitute for wild boar, because they weren't allowed to release any wild boar. They shoved in some red deer and some Exmoor ponies, and then they just stepped back. And the idea is to just let nature take its course, to not try and manage for anything in particular. They're not trying to encourage certain species or anything. They just want to see what nature will do left to its own devices. And I think that's rather cool. They did throw in a couple of other species as well more recently. Beavers went in, I think, last year or the year before. I've not seen them yet, but I'd love to. And the storks have been there a while now, and you will, if you do visit Knepp, I guarantee you'll see the storks because you can't miss them. They're nesting on all the trees, very obviously. Amazing birds, because they chatter to each other by clattering their bills. Anyway, it was set up 20 years ago, and I would encourage anyone who is at all interested to go, whatever you think of rewilding. Go in a nice day in spring or summer and go for a walk, and you will hear nightingales singing, which is a really rare sound in Britain these days. You will almost certainly hear cuckoos in the spring, which are, again, very, very rare in lowland Britain. They're tanking nationwide, but thriving at Knepp. There are turtle doves breeding there. Turtle doves are very nearly extinct in Britain, but they've somehow arrived at Knepp and are doing well. They've got the biggest population of purple emperor butterflies in the whole of Britain, having had none 20 years ago. And this summer they had large tortoiseshells, which are supposed to be extinct in Britain, but somehow they popped up at Knepp. I'm slightly suspicious. I think maybe someone snuck them in. But anyway, one way or another, it's working. There are heaps of insects. We've counted over 90 species of bee at Knepp. There are all these birds that are thriving. It's a pretty cool place, and it seems to me that we could have a few more of those. We need farming. We can't rewild the whole of Britain, but on the least productive land that's not financially viable without huge subsidies, maybe a viable alternative is to look after biodiversity and capture carbon and provide amazing recreational opportunities for people, because thousands of people go to NEP every day in the spring and summer. I would love to see a bit more rewilding. Okay, the third and largest topic in terms of solutions to the insect crisis is what we can do in urban areas. And this is something everyone can get involved in, and it's quite nice because a lot of environmental issues, you know, we feel quite helpless about climate change and when you see the rainforest being burned down and so on. But insects live all around us. They live in our gardens, they live in our local parks and road verges and so on. And we can all do stuff that will very quickly and visibly benefit them. And see, and that's kind of nice because it makes you, it empowers you to get going and to encourage your friends and neighbours to do likewise. Let me throw some figures at you. There are about 22 million private gardens in the UK, covering an area of about 400,000 hectares. That isn't a bigger area than our national parks, as Megan McCubin said on Springwatch. But it is a bigger area than all of the nature reserves in Britain. And just imagine if most of our gardens were wildlife friendly. And better still, if we could get the councils on board so that the road verges and the roundabouts were full of flowers and the parks had areas of wildflowers. And cemeteries and any other bit of urban green space we can lay our hands on. That collectively could make a national network or an international network of insect wildlife-friendly habitat. And there isn't really any cost to doing this. You know, changing farming is tricky because there are lots of other pressures. But encouraging wildflowers on a road verge, you're not really paying a price there. Encouraging bees and butterflies in your garden, there is no downside to doing that. And the exciting thing is there's loads of people already doing this. It's something that's happening right now. It's kind of a movement. We just need to accelerate it along, I think. I haven't got time to go into all the things that you can do in a garden. If you want to know more, sorry to plug my books, but there you go. I do have a few books with me in a suitcase, should anyone want some at the end. So we think that gardening is a green activity, don't we? I mean, what could be more green than growing plants, growing vegetables and flowers and so on? But we should be aware that not everyone gardens in quite that way. And there is also, as well as a growing movement towards wilder gardens, there is a sector of society which is rapidly going in the other direction, and sales of plastic grass are rocketing. And some people think that this is what a garden should look like. I took this next picture myself a few weeks ago. That is a plastic hedge. You can get plastic hedges now. I mean, and online I've seen for sale plastic wisteria to pin to your house, and it flowers for 12 months of the year. What's not to love? It's so awful, isn't it? I mean, who would want to plastic anyway? It fills me with despair when I see things like this. I won't rant about the evils of plastic grass. I'm sure you all agree with me that it's not great. But I would love it if we could somehow reach a situation where people were embarrassed to do this, where it was frowned upon, where people sneered at them and looked disdainful as they walked past, and maybe they might get the message. Or maybe we could just ban the darn stuff altogether, would be better still. Can but hope. Anyway, so that's a pretty obviously bad way to garden for wildlife. But I think we're probably all guilty of slightly more subtle environmental harms associated with gardening. You know, many of us at the weekend might drive to a big garden centre and get a trolley and fill it with annual bedding plants grown in disposable plastic pots, probably in a peat-based compost, almost certainly treated with fertilisers and pesticides. And we might get a sack of compost with more peat in it, and we might get some Roundup to clear the weeds on the drive and some bug clear to kill the aphids on the roses. And you can see where I'm going. Garden centres sell a whole load of products that are really bad for the environment. On the other hand, gardening can be amazing for wildlife. And one of the nicest examples I've come across is that of Jenny Owen, who was a lady who lived in in Leicester, quite near the city centre, and she had a small garden of about 1/8 of an acre that she encouraged wildlife in. But what's really interesting was she spent 35 years trying to identify every single species of everything in her garden, every plant, every animal, every insect, every bird. And her species list after 35 years was 2,673. Isn't that unbelievable? That thousands of species can live in a small urban garden. So we can all have thousands of species living all around us if we just do a few simple things to encourage them, and generally just garden more gently, tread more lightly. So a few specific things we might do in our gardens. There's pretty good evidence that native is better than non-native when it comes to choosing plants. There's 2 studies in particular. This one's one I've been involved in that's available online if anyone's interested. It goes into more detail about exactly which plants are best for which insect groups and so on. There was an RHS study also performed at Wisley that found that on average you get slightly more insect visitors to the flowers of native plants compared to non-natives, which kind of makes sense because obviously our native insects have co-evolved with our native plants over thousands of years. But actually the difference isn't at all big, and there are some non-natives that are really super attractive to pollinators. As beekeepers, you'll know this. Things like Phacelia, amazing plant, is North American, but the bees don't care. They just like the sweet nectar. The reality is pollinators aren't that fussy about where a plant comes from. But herbivorous insects are, which I'll come to in a second. But before I do, let me just show you from our trial, the 3 best native wildflowers. This is not to say we grew 111 different species and varieties. There were many more that we didn't trial, but of the ones that were trialled, marjoram, Viper's bugloss, and greater knapweed were the 3 best in terms of the total number of insects attracted in a year to a metre square patch of the flower. But I don't want everybody to go and plant the same things. That would be really boring. Mix it up a bit, but that's just a few top tips. But anyway, the bees don't actually care too much where a plant is from, as I say. Nectar is nectar, whether it's from North America or China or whatever, more or less. But herbivorous insects are really fussy, and this is where the real benefit of planting natives comes in. So, for example, the caterpillars of butterflies and moths, they tend to be very specific about what they will eat. They will not eat non-native plants. They will only eat usually 1 or 2 species of native plant. And here's a familiar example of a beautiful orange-tipped butterfly, which you can easily get travelling through your garden, visiting flowers. If you grow some lady's smock or garlic mustard, which are 2 cabbage family wildflowers, there's a really good chance that the female butterfly will come and lay her eggs on there, and you can have your own little breeding population of orange-tipped butterflies in your garden. If you don't grow one of those 2 plants, you can absolutely guarantee the butterfly will not breed in your garden because the food plant isn't there, it can't. And so every native plant you add will support more species of native insects. And to take it to a kind of extreme, think if you were to plant, say, an oak tree, oak trees can support more than 280 species of insect. Whereas if you plant a gum tree, unless you've got a pet koala, nothing is going to eat it at all, because our native insects can't deal with gum tree leaves. They're not native. So plant native wherever you can. Which brings me on to the sort of thorny subject of weeds. What is a weed? And of course, a weed is a concept we invented for a plant that we don't like, or a plant that's in the wrong place or something. And there are certain plants which pretty much everyone regards as a weed. But I'm sure you know, as beekeepers, these are also really valuable plants for insects. Things like dandelions, ragwort, all the different species of thistle. These 3, actually, they're among the most attractive plants to insect pollinators of all of our wild flora. And yet we spend a lot of time, or collectively many people spend a lot of time, digging them up or poisoning them to try and get rid of them. I've got them all in my garden, I'm pleased to say. Anyway, so you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden, just like that, by just calling them all wildflowers, because that is basically what they are. did come across, there's a lovely little project in East London run by a lady called Sophie Le Guil, I'm never sure how you pronounce her surname, called More Than Weeds, where she's been surveying how many species of plants she can find growing on in the cracks in the pavement in her local area in London. Her species list is now 47 species of plant. And when she finds them, she labels them with chalk to draw passers-by's attention to this sort of botanical biodiversity, which is literally under their feet. I thought that was really sweet. Unfortunately, not every council is so enthusiastic about the merits of plants growing in cracks in the pavement. And this kind of thing is all too common a sight. This was taken down in Christchurch in Dorset, but it could have been in many other places in Britain. You can see what it is, of course. It was a bit of greenery growing around a silver birch. It's been sprayed off with herbicide by the local council. Many councils employ teams of guys, or not necessarily guys, sorry, that's a sexist thing to say, teams of people to drive the streets looking for anything green, and if they see it, they'll jump out and kill it. Why is that necessary? It seems completely nuts. Apparently it costs money at a time when money is scarce, but it seems like completely unnecessary environmental vandalism. Was that little bit of grass doing any real harm? It surely doesn't look better like that. There's a more sinister side to this as well. It isn't just about the environmental impacts. They will almost certainly have used glyphosate, Roundup, with active ingredient glyphosate, which the World Health Organization says is a probable carcinogen. And there's quite a lot of evidence that it causes cancer in people. Disputed by the manufacturers, of course. But while there's doubt, should we really be spraying it in our streets? I've even seen children's play equipment being sprayed with Roundup. Seems completely nuts, all just for the sake of some concept of tidiness. Personally, I would just ban pesticides for garden use. We don't need them. You really, really can do without pesticides in your garden, and the local council don't need them in the streets and in the parks and so on. And if you dispute that, then look to France, because France banned pesticide use in urban areas in 2018. And Paris is still standing. It hasn't been overrun with dandelions and cockroaches or whatever. If France can be pesticide free in its urban areas, so can London, so can everywhere, I think. Again, no real downside to it. Most of you probably don't spray pesticides in your garden, I would guess, as beekeepers, or you keep it to a minimum, I hope, at least. But we can inadvertently bring pesticides into our gardens in other ways, and I just wanted to flag up two of them briefly. One is that the beautiful plants on sale in your local garden centre have almost certainly been sprayed with a whole load of different pesticides to keep them looking perfect before you buy them. And I know this because we did a study which we published a couple of years ago now, where we went around all the local garden centres, the big names like B&Q and Homebase and so on, and we bought the plants that they were selling with either the RHS's Perfect for Pollinator logo on it or some other kind of bee-friendly logo. And we tested them for pesticides. And 98% of them were positive for at least one pesticide. 75% of them had neonicotinoid insecticides in them, which are notoriously poisonous to bees and other insects. There was one little heather plant that we bought that tested positive for 10 different pesticides. Dear God, was that really necessary to keep that little plant alive? Awful. So do beware. It's much better to find an organic nursery or grow from seed or do plant swaps with your friends and neighbours rather than buying those glossy, beautiful looking but dangerous plants from the garden centre. Right, a couple more things before I wrap up. This is a really obvious one. I think everyone's got the message that mowing less often is good for wildlife, bees and other insects. That's my lawn, and if you can just restrain yourself and get over this kind of, we seem to, again, this tidy instinct and this urge to create stripes in a lawn. What is that all about? I mean, why do we need a Wimbledon tennis court appearance in our back garden? If you can just, instead of getting the mower out, get a deck chair and make yourself a gin and tonic, it's a much better way to spend your time. Of course, it isn't just our gardens that have where we mow. The council, again, will mow. Typically, road verges have been managed for many years by cutting them about 8 times a year, and that really isn't necessary. There's sometimes visibility issues, and you might need to cut the ½ metre closest to the road to stop that getting too tall. But most of our road verges could look like that if we wanted them to, and most of our roundabouts likewise, and wouldn't that be great? So that's been sown with a wildflower seed mix, which brings me to the final topic I wanted to say a tiny bit about, which relates to what seed mixes should we grow, both in our gardens and in other situations. And I think there's a lot of confusion about this because there are so many different seed mixes out there. Big topic, but which I'm only going to treat rather shallowly. But it seems to me that roughly there are 3 broad categories of seed mix that people are using. The first one would be a brightly coloured annual mix. They're sometimes called pictorial meadows. These were used really extensively around the Olympic Park in 2012, and everyone said how amazing they looked, and they are really colourful. They're basically a mix of quick flowering annual plants, things like poppies and Californian poppies and all sorts of other things, cosmos, which provide lots of colour and do provide food for some pollinators. But they're often sold as wildflowers, which to me suggests that they're native, but most of them are not native plants. And it does rather worry me that people sowing these mixes think they're replacing wildflower meadows, and they're not. They're growing a mishmash of plants from China and North America and all over the place, which are okay for bees and so on, but as I mentioned, not so good for the bulk of insects which like to eat the leaves of plants, which can't eat non-native plants. So these maybe have a role to play in urban areas if you want lots of colour quickly, but I don't think they're the optimum thing from a wildlife perspective. The second mix is an arable weed mix, things like cornflowers, corn cockles, corn marigolds and poppies. Again, fast-flowering annuals that provide a lovely show in the first year but will then disappear subsequently unless you manage them. These are more or less native. Some people, so it's thought that these arable weeds came in with Neolithic farmers, and therefore some people argue they're not native. I think it's being a bit pedantic if they've been here for 4,000 or so years, and maybe we should give them the benefit of the doubt. But anyway, they're native-ish, and perhaps a better option than the previous one if you just want lots of colour in the first year. But I would direct you towards the third option if you're serious about sowing a wildflower patch in your garden, or you're lucky enough to have a field or whatever. Britain used to have huge areas of species-rich grasslands, perennial flowers, things like clovers and vetches and trefoils and so on. It's a really biodiverse habitat with thousands of insects and plants and birds and so on associated with it. We destroyed almost all of it in the 20th century. In 1930, we had about 7 million acres of hay meadows and chalk downland. And in about 50 years, we destroyed 97% of it in the mid-20th century. This is now a really rare habitat, which is teems with life. And you can get lovely seed mixes of this kind of habitat and recreate them. They're not quite as flashy. They don't give you all the colour in the first year that you get with poppies and cornflowers and so on. But from a wildlife perspective, they're fantastic. Okay, so to wrap up, I think we need to kind of rewild ourselves a bit if we can. At least try and overcome this urge to kind of kill and control, and not regard nature as an expendable, something to exploit, something to use up as we see fit, and realise that actually we're part of nature. We can't survive without it, and I don't understand why people can't grasp that. If you stop to think about it, and we rarely do, it's really absurd. We live on a rock, hurtling through space with a little crust of life clinging to its surface. I mean, it's completely remarkable and unique. It's our home. Whatever Elon Musk says, we're not going to be jetting off to live on Mars anytime soon. We should be looking after what we have. And it really worries me that, I've got kids. what kind of world are we going to leave them? You know, we would all do absolutely anything for our children, apart from leave them a decent planet to live on, it seems. And we've got to do better, and we can do better. And I think one of the simplest places to start is by looking after all these little creatures that live all around us.
One shocking statistic is you say there's 135 species going extinct every day in the Amazon area, correct? I think you mentioned that, 135.
If you just read the book, you've read it more recently than I have.
Okay. I was wondering how that figure can be arrived at if we only know a third or a fourth or even a fifth of the total species of insects that there are.
Yeah, scientists have argued endlessly about how fast species are going extinct. The honest truth is we don't really know, or we can't know, because we don't know how many, we haven't yet counted what we have, so it's impossible to know when something goes extinct. It's more based on probability that we know how much habitat is being lost, and if you extrapolate from that and the known relationship between the area of habitat and the number of species it's likely to contain, then you can estimate how many species probably disappear every time a square mile of rainforest is destroyed or whatever. But often there'll be species, one of the kind of really poignant things is often there'll be species going extinct that before we've ever discovered them, so we'll never know. Which is, you know, I don't know why it matters that we haven't discovered them. It seems all the more sad that, you know, there are organisms which have already gone extinct because of us that we didn't even register, you know. Anyway, yeah, they're all very crude estimates.
I'm just interested in your view on seed collection. So I try and grow native species, and I try and harvest seed every year of things that have done particularly well, and then replant the following year. Is that generally better, do you think, than going and buying the F1 hybrids from the garden centre? I think you know the answer to that. Yes. I mean, local provenance wildflower seeds as much as possible, or collecting your own ornamental flower seeds, it has generally lower impact on the environment. But ideally, because wild plant species have genetic variation. The ones in Scotland will be slightly different cultivars to the ones growing here, so it's much better to collect your local seed or collect the seed you've grown in the garden and re-sow it than buying a packet every year, which could come, I mean, often they don't even come from the UK.
In your photo of the supermarket or whatever, food available before with insecticides and without insecticides, it looked as though there was a big heap of apples. Were they apples or were they what?
I think they're oranges.
But are they not pollinated?
No, most oranges will self-pollinate. I believe. Happy to be corrected, but that's as I understand it.
I have personally noticed a huge decrease in the amount and diversity of the wildlife and insects. Would it be fair to attribute this mainly to the neonicotinoid outbreak? And how long do you think, if we actually stop using these things, will it take before we get some notable recovery?
I actually don't think we should attribute too much of it to one particular group of pesticides. I mean, wildlife was declining before 1994 when neonicotinoids were introduced, and it's still declining now after they've been banned. I think it's more the habitat loss and the industrialization of farming and all the pesticides associated with it. So although that one group of pesticides have been banned, they've been replaced by a whole bunch of others, and I'm pretty confident that in 10 or 20 years we'll discover that they're just as harmful. So actually, I wouldn't expect things, sadly, to be recovering unless we move away from a system where farmers rely on chemicals to control pests as the first choice option. Then I don't think things are going to improve, sadly.
My son has recently finished a course at a college in Surrey on countryside management, and we now have family arguments because he has been taught on his countryside management that actually as a beekeeper I'm doing the wrong thing. And I'm sure you've heard this argument perhaps before, where we are now keeping bees and we're keeping honeybees, whereas we're now taking away some of the natural pollen and nectar away from the wild bees. And I find it really hard to argue with him because I can't actually come up with anything. You know, he's always got another reply, and I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
There is clear evidence that high densities of honeybees reduces the abundance of wild pollinators, bumblebee nests grow more slowly, and so on. And it's clearly partly through competition, and also you do get, according to some research from Royal Holloway recently, on average there's a net flow of disease from honeybees out into wild pollinators. However carefully you manage your honeybees, they usually have a few viruses and whatnot. So there is a conflict there, and it's always a really awkward one when someone insists on bringing this up at a beekeeper meeting. I think that, beekeepers and bee conservationists, insect conservationists are natural allies. We all want fewer pesticides, more flowers, a healthier countryside, and our bees to be happy. I think there just needs to be a little bit of recognition that you can have too many honeybees, and people taking up beekeeping thinking that they're helping solve the bee crisis have completely misunderstood the nature of the crisis. And so re-educating people so that we don't end up with, thousands of hives in central London with well-meaning but misguided people introducing far more bees than the habitat can support. So, just a bit of common sense is all it really comes down to. There's plenty of room for all of our bees as long as we look after the environment.